Pack your things, kid. Tomorrow night you're getting transferred. That word transferred hit Matteo like a knife. At just 10 years old, the orphanage called Santa Lucia had already taught him one rule. If you wanted to survive, you had to be invisible. But that morning, he saw Director Barrera pull 3 new kids aside, smiling the way wolves smile. Matteo heard the phone call. He heard the prices hidden inside polite words. And he understood the truth: the next transfer wasn't to a better home. It was to nowhere. So that night, with shaking hands and a single blurry photo of his parents tucked against his chest, Matteo slipped through a loose section of wall and ran barefoot until the streets turned into water and silence. At the edge of the polluted lake, he spotted it, a forgotten floating platform, like a broken promise drifting in the fog. He couldn't swim. He was terrified of water, but fear of Barrera was worse. Using rotten planks and an old tire, he built a crude raft and pushed himself toward the floating house. Inside, he found canned food, clean water, and a life that didn't belong to him. Photographs of a kind woman named Elena Rivera, journal's official letters. Beneath a hatch, Matteo discovered metal chests filled with cash jewelry maps and evidence. Elena had been investigating Barrera's child trafficking network. She'd vanished before delivering the truth. When Barrera finally arrived by boat, Matteo escaped with the documents, hunted like a witness instead of a runaway. And in a crowded market, an elderly flower seller, Marisol, became the first adult to believe him, leading him to attorney Gabriel Soto and an incorruptible journalist, Clara Ibanez. Matteo wasn't just running anymore. He was carrying the truth. Matteo didn't run because he was brave. He ran because staying meant disappearing. That afternoon, while the other children sat in the courtyard pretending to study, Matteo memorized everything: the guard's footsteps, the way the south wall leaned just enough to hide a weakness, the hour when fear itself seemed to fall asleep. Director Barrera watched him from across the yard, smiling softly, the way a man smiles when he already owns something. "Special opportunities are coming for you," Barrera said, resting a heavy hand on Matteo's shoulder. Matteo nodded. He said nothing. He had learned silence could save your life. That night, the orphanage smelled like rust and old soap. Metal beds creaked with every breath. Matteo lay awake, heart pounding so loudly he feared it would wake the others. He thought about the kids who had been transferred, how their beds were emptied by morning, how no one ever said their names again. When the guard's snoring finally filled the hallway, Matteo moved. He slid his small body through the window, tearing his shirt on splintered wood. His feet hit the cold ground, barefoot, shaking. At the wall, his fingers bled as he pulled loose brick by brick, pain burning but distant. Pain was familiar. Fear was not. On the other side waited darkness, wide, endless, terrifying freedom. Matteo ran. He ran through empty streets, hid behind parked cars, when sirens wailed, swallowed sobs, when dogs barked in the distance. Every shadow looked like Barrera. Every sound felt like a hand grabbing his collar. His lungs burned. His legs screamed. But he didn't stop. By dawn, the city dissolved into water. The lake spread before him, gray and unforgiving, carrying the weight of old stories and forgotten lives. Matteo collapsed at the shoreline, shaking, starving, his feet cut and swollen. That's when he saw it floating far from land, silent and abandoned. A platform. A place no one would look for a child. He knew he couldn't swim. He knew the water could kill him. But he also knew this: if Barrera found him, the water would be kinder. With scraps of wood and an old tire, Matteo built something fragile and desperate like himself. As he pushed the raft into the lake, Clutching the photo of his parents beneath his shirt, he whispered a promise he didn't know how to keep. Just let me live. Just one more day. And the water carried him forward. The lake did not welcome Matteo. It tested him. Cold water seeped through the cracks between the rotten planks, biting at his ankles as he paddled with bare hands. What had looked close from the shore now felt impossibly far. Each stroke burned his shoulders. Each ripple rocked the fragile raft like it was deciding whether to keep him or swallow him whole. Halfway across, voices drifted over the water. Spread out. He couldn't have gone far. Matteo froze. His fingers dug into the wood as he shrank low, heart slamming against his ribs. On the shore, 3 figures moved along the reeds. One held a radio. Another scanned the water. He recognized the voice even at a distance, Director Barrera. Calm. Certain. Like a man who had never lost anything he wanted. Matteo paddled again, slower now, quieter, afraid even his breathing might betray him. The raft creaked in protest. His arms trembled. For a moment, panic whispered that he should turn back, that maybe this was worse. Then the platform loomed out of the fog. Up close, it was larger than he'd imagined, concrete and rusted metal anchored in shallow water, crowned with a sagging wooden structure that looked like it had been forgotten by time itself. No lights, no movement, no life. To Matteo, it looked like mercy. The final meters felt endless. His hands slipped. The raft spun. Water surged higher around his calves. When the wood finally scraped against the platform's edge, Matteo let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Climbing up took everything he had left. He collapsed onto the cold surface chest, heaving fingers, numb ears, straining for the sound of engines or footsteps. But there was only the lake, soft, endless, indifferent. For the first time since he ran, no one was shouting his name. Inside the structure, the air smelled of damp wood and dust. Light filtered through newspaper-covered windows, painting the floor in faded gold. Matteo slid down against the wall, too exhausted to move, too afraid to sleep. Yet sleep came anyway. As his eyes closed, one thought drifted through him, fragile, but stubborn. They won't look for me here. And somewhere beneath the floor, secrets waited, quiet, patient, ready to change everything. Matteo woke to silence, so complete it felt unreal, not the sharp, watchful silence of the orphanage. This was softer, almost kind. Late afternoon light slipped through the cracks of the windows, filtered by yellowed newspapers, taped long ago, casting warm shapes on the dusty floor. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then hunger clawed at his stomach, and the truth came rushing back. He was alone, and somehow safe. Moving slowly, careful not to make a sound, even though no one could hear him. Matteo explored the floating house. The floor creaked beneath his weight, but it didn't threaten to collapse. In a tiny kitchen, he found something that made his knees weaken cans. Real food. Beans. Soup. A half-filled water jug sealed tight. He drank too fast, choking, as the water burned its way down his throat, tears spilling without permission. He ate straight from the can, with a chipped spoon, hands shaking every bite, tasting like survival. This place hadn't been abandoned in anger. It had been left behind gently. In the next room, he found furniture covered with old sheets, books stacked in uneven towers, and framed photographs dusted but intact. They showed the same woman over and over, a gentle face, silver-streaked hair eyes that smiled even when her mouth didn't. In some photos, she stood beside children, her arm around their shoulders protective. In one, she stood right here on this floating house when it still looked alive. Matteo felt something tighten in his chest. A name appeared again and again. Elena Rivera on envelopes, letters, official seals, education departments, child welfare agencies, handwritten notes thanking her for her work, for helping children who had no one else. She helped kids like me, Matteo whispered. That night, lying on a narrow bed that still smelled faintly of lavender, Mateo stared at the ceiling. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was inside the echo of someone else's life, someone who had cared, who had fought quietly, who had disappeared. As sleep pulled him under, a strange thought settled in his chest, equal parts comfort and fear. This house wasn't empty by accident, and Elena Rivera hadn't left without a reason. Mateo found the hatch by accident. It was hidden beneath a loose plank in the kitchen floor, a thin seam that didn't belong. When he pulled it open, cold air rose from below, carrying the smell of metal and damp paper. A ladder descended into darkness, and every instinct told him to close it, to pretend he'd never seen anything. Children like him survived by not knowing too much. But Elena Rivera hadn't been afraid of knowing. The space beneath the house sat just above the waterline, sealed and silent, holding its breath. Mateo's fingers brushed against metal, one chest, then another. He pried the first open with a rusted tool and froze. Money. More than he'd ever imagined. Neatly bundled bills, jewelry wrapped in cloth that still shimmered faintly in the dim light. For a terrifying second, he wondered if Elena had been something else entirely. Then he saw the papers, maps of the lake marked with careful symbols, lists of names, children's names with dates beside them, addresses, notes written in tight, urgent handwriting. Mateo recognized one name immediately. Santa Lucia Orphanage, Director R. Barrera. His hands began to shake. There were letters addressed to authorities that had never been sent. Photographs taken from a distance. Barrera shaking hands with men in suits. Bank records. Transfer dates. The word transfer appeared again and again, each time meaning something darker, something final. At the bottom of the chest lay a single document folded so many times the paper had gone soft. Mateo read slowly, lips moving. I have enough proof now. The children are in immediate danger. If anything happens to me, this evidence must reach the federal prosecutors. Signed, Elena Rivera. Mateo sank to the floor, breath shallow, heart racing. Elena hadn't disappeared by chance. She hadn't abandoned this place. She had been stopped. And somehow, by running barefoot into the night, by trusting broken wood and cold water, Mateo had stumbled into her unfinished fight. The truth pressed against his chest, heavy and terrifying. He wasn't just a runaway anymore. He was holding the reason people vanished. And if Barrera found him now, it wouldn't be to bring him back. It would be to make sure he never spoke. The sound came at dusk. An engine. Low, steady, getting closer. Mateo froze, the papers still clutched to his chest, like a shield that suddenly felt made of glass. He moved to the window, peeling back a corner of the newspaper just enough to see. 3 boats cut across the water, spreading wide, closing in. And on the center boat stood a man Mateo knew the way prey knows a shadow. Director Barrera. The truth hit harder than fear. They hadn't come for a runaway. They had come for the evidence. Mateo didn't panic. Not at first. Panic came later, when he heard boots strike the platform, when voices echoed through the floating house, calm and confident, like this place already belonged to them. He shoved documents into a plastic bag, then into a worn backpack. He grabbed only what mattered, the proof, and the photo of his parents. As an afterthought, almost a prayer, he slipped one photograph of Elena Rivera into the side pocket. Her eyes seemed to follow him, steady, unafraid. Mateo Barrera called, his voice smooth as oil. You don't have to make this hard. The words chased Mateo down the narrow hallway. He saw the window at the back, the one he'd noticed days earlier. Open water. A 3-meter drop. His stomach twisted. He couldn't swim. Not really. The lake was dark now, swallowing the last of the light. Barrera's footsteps grew closer. Mateo didn't think. He jumped. The impact knocked the breath from his body. Cold water dragged him under the weight of the backpack, pulling him down like a hand around his ankle. Panic screamed. His chest burned. For one awful moment he thought this was it, that the lake would keep him. But instinct kicked harder than fear. He kicked. He clawed upward. He broke the surface, gasping, choking, and began to swim ugly, desperate strokes toward the shore. Shouts erupted behind him. A man dove in. The distance felt endless. His arms burned. His strength faded. Then he saw it. A floating log, close enough. Matteo wrapped himself around it, breath-ragged heart exploding, and let it carry him just long enough to survive. When he reached land, he crawled into the reeds, soaked, shaking, alive. Behind him, Barrera shouted orders. Ahead of him lay darkness, danger, and a choice. Matteo pressed the backpack to his chest. He wasn't running anymore. He was escaping with the truth. Matteo didn't stop moving for 3 days. He slept in places no one looked twice at, under bridges that smelled of rust and urine, inside abandoned buildings where the walls whispered with old graffiti beneath park benches, where the city's noise became a kind of camouflage. The backpack never left his body. He learned to sleep, curled around it, one arm threaded through the straps, waking at every footstep, every cough, every shift in the air, every shift. He tried asking for help once. Just once. Outside a police station, he saw an officer laughing with a man whose boots he recognized from the lake. Matteo turned away before he was seen, his chest tightening with a new, bitter understanding. The system didn't just fail kids like him. It was built to swallow them. Hunger finally drove him into the market. That's where Marisol found him. She was small and bent with age, selling flowers arranged with careful hands, their colors too bright for such a harsh place. When she looked at Matteo, she didn't see a thief or a problem. She saw a child who hadn't eaten. "Are you hungry?" she asked softly. Matteo nodded. The question broke something open inside him. As he ate warm food behind her stall, Marisol watched him the way grandmothers do, quietly, completely. When Matteo finally spoke Elena Rivera's name, her eyes filled with tears. "She was my daughter in spirit," Marisol whispered. "She disappeared trying to protect children." For the first time since the lake, Matteo felt the ground steady beneath his feet. Marisol took him to Gabriel Soto, a human rights lawyer who lived far from power and closer to truth. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with every document Matteo pulled from the bag. When he finished, Gabriel exhaled slowly. "This is enough to bring them down," he said, "and enough to get you killed if we don't act carefully." That night, Matteo met Clara Ibanez, a journalist with tired eyes and an unbreakable spine. She read the files in silence, then closed the folder like a promise. "They tried to bury this," she said. They failed. Matteo sat very still as the adults spoke strategy and danger. He was scared, terrified, but for the first time someone believed him, and that changed everything. The truth didn't explode into the world. It broke through slow at first, then all at once. For weeks, Matteo lived inside safe rooms with locked doors and unfamiliar silence, while Clara Ibanez worked like someone racing the night. She verified every name, every date, every transfer. She spoke to children who had escaped years earlier, now adults with hollow eyes and trembling hands, whose stories matched Elena Rivera's notes line by line. Gabriel Soto filed motions in secret, reaching past local offices, poisoned by Barrera's money, straight to federal authorities who had not yet learned his name. Matteo watched from the edges of rooms as adults argued strategy risk timing. He understood only one thing clearly now. Once the story went live, there would be no hiding again. The morning the article published, the air felt different, electric tight. Matteo sat beside Clara as the headline appeared on the screen. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A decade of stolen childhoods. The network that sold the invisible. Phones began ringing before the page finished loading. Within hours, federal agents moved. Not just to Santa Lucia, but to 6 cities at once. Warrants stacked like dominoes. Doors forced open. Bank accounts frozen. Files seized. On television screens across the country, Matteo saw Rafael Barrera led out in handcuffs, his confident smile gone, replaced by something small and frantic. But the moment that undid Matteo came later. Live footage showed children being escorted out of the orphanage, wrapped in blankets, clutching bags that held their entire lives. Some looked confused, some terrified, some hopeful. Matteo recognized faces, beds he'd slept beside, names he'd seen on Elena's lists. "They're safe now," Marisol whispered, squeezing his hand. Matteo cried, not loudly, not all at once. He cried for Elena Rivera, who never saw this day, for the children found, for the ones who weren't, for the boy who had run barefoot into the night believing no one would listen. The world finally had, and Matteo understood something that would stay with him forever. Truth is heavy, but when carried together it can move mountains. Matteo didn't step into his new life all at once. He crossed into it slowly, like someone testing the weight of solid ground after years of water. For months after the arrests, his name disappeared. Not erased, but protected. He lived in quiet houses with curtains always drawn, guarded by people who spoke gently and watched carefully. Some nights he woke gasping, certain he heard engines on the lake again. Certain Barrera's voice was calling his name. On those nights Marisol would sit beside him, humming softly, reminding him where he was. Safe. Still here. The world knew his story, but Matteo was allowed to be just a child again. When the adoption papers were finally signed, he stood in a small office with Daniel and Rosa Herrera, a couple whose eyes held patience instead of pity. They didn't promise miracles. They promised consistency. Dinner at the same hour. School the next morning. A room where no one would come in at night to take him away. Matteo took their last name, but he chose a middle one himself. Matteo Rivera Herrera, not to replace Elena, but to carry her. The first night in his new home, Matteo lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to ordinary sounds. Dishes being washed, a television murmuring in another room, a door closing gently. No shouting, no footsteps counting beds. His chest ached with something unfamiliar. Peace. He went back to school slowly. Some days were hard. Loud noises still made him flinch. Authority still felt dangerous. But Daniel never raised his voice. Rosa never stopped showing up. And when Matteo spoke about the lake, about the documents, about the woman who had died for children, no one saw, neither of them told him to forget. "Remember," Rosa said once, brushing his hair back, "but don't live there." Matteo placed Elena's photograph on his desk next to the picture of his parents, past and present, side by side. He was no longer a boy running from something. He was a boy growing toward something. And for the first time in his life, the future didn't feel like a threat. 5 years later, Matteo stood still in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of a borrowed jacket, his hands no longer shaking. He was 15 now, taller, steadier, his eyes carrying something deeper than fear. Outside the room, voices gathered. Children's voices. Laughter. The sound once felt impossible. The sign behind him read, "The Elena Rivera Foundation." What had started as survival had become a mission. Matteo remembered the floating house, the silence, the cold water, the truth hidden beneath rotten wood. He remembered running not because he believed he would win, but because he refused to disappear quietly. Now the foundation's doors were opening to children who looked like he once had scared invisible, waiting for someone to notice. When Matteo stepped forward to speak, his voice was calm. "I used to think being saved meant someone pulling you out," he said. "But sometimes, it means finding the courage to carry the truth even when you're small." Around him stood the people who had changed his life. Marisol, older now but smiling. Gabriel and Clara still fighting in their own ways. And children who were alive because someone had refused to stay silent. Matteo understood then what Elena Rivera had known all along. Hope doesn't arrive loudly. It survives quietly until someone protects it. And now it was his turn. This story reminds us of something essential. Change does not begin with power, it begins with courage. You don't have to be strong, rich, or grown to matter. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to look away, refusing to stay silent, refusing to accept injustice as normal. If this story touched something inside you, ask yourself, who needs my voice today? And if you believe stories like Mateo's deserve to be heard, leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us why compassion, courage, and truth still matter. Because maybe, just maybe, you needed this story today.